Let me ask you this. What is your favorite food? Pie. Oh, yes, we're right in the season. Excellent. Any others?
Macaroni and cheese.
Yeah. All right. Now get your stomach's ready for a 3-hour sermon, right? Now I have several things I would say would be my favorite foods. You might consider like pizza or cheesesteak if I'm back home in Philly. But one of my favorite foods I would declare now is salt. Salt. I love salt. I especially love salty pretzels. Those are the best. Even more specifically, salty, soft pretzels. Growing up in Philly, that's the cultural mecca of soft pretzels. People go and they're just delicious. We eat them breakfast, lunch, and dinner. When my sister came to visit me just a few months ago, she had a nice box of soft pretzels she brought, and we were just like chowed. I wanted to eat them all that first night, but we had the space now. I had to share them with my kids and so. Now, I love pretzels. They are worth their weight in salt, and the salt for me, the saltier the better. Now, I know some people think about sweet pretzels. That's a whole different food group. We're not even going to go into that. But this morning, I'm going to invite my son to come up. He's going to pass out a little thing for you. You might have seen this basket up here. I've made for you fresh from my own hands, or a box I bought at Hanford, little pretzel bites, right? And in there, you have 4 options. You've got excessively salty, my favorite. You've got some with regular amount of salt. You've got the lightly salted, and then you've got the worst thing ever created, the saltless one. So go ahead and pass it around, right? Because one thing I really can't stand are saltless pretzels. Pretzels without salt, they have no point. They are good for nothing. They are disgusting. And I think there's a theologian, William Barclay, I've quoted before, he would agree with me. He says this. He says that food without salt is sadly insipid and is even a sickening thing. I mean, I agree. Amen. Food without salt is disgusting. And even Jesus would agree that they should be thrown out and trampled by man. It's not even good for the manure pile. Right? Yes. All right. So this week, we've moving on. Last week we wrapped up our series with the beatitudes, and it was great. Great to hear from all the different people that shared. Wanda gave us that call to worship, that personalizing, and then we heard the stories from Mimi and Debbie and Judy and Joel and Anna Maria talking about how these statements of God's blessedness and how that impacted their lives and their relationship with God and others. Because in the Beatitudes, we talked about how it flips our understanding of happiness on its head. And Jesus showed us that true happiness isn't based on the things that are happening around us, but this joy that we discover when we have a right relationship with God and ourselves and others. And I love what my son Joel said last week about how these Beatitudes, we come at it with 2 different definitions. There's the definition that we bring, and then there's a definition that God brings into that. I think that will fit with our understanding of salt today, because we move on from these 8 Beatitudes to Jesus declaring us to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. It's a strange metaphor for us, maybe, this idea of being salt of the earth and light of the world. Now, it's not a simile, right? He's not saying you are like the salt of the earth or you're like the light of the world, but we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And next week, we're going to talk about how Jesus declares us to be the light of the world. And then as we go through Advent, we're going to look at some of the statements that Jesus said where he declared himself to be the light of the world. And so somehow Jesus is the light of the world and we are the light of the world. And we're both shining in darkness. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that later. This week, you are the salt of the earth. I don't know if Jesus coined that phrase or that was just an idea that was already floating around. We all have this idea of what it means to be the salt of the earth. Salt back then was considered a highly valuable thing in the Greek and Roman world. There was a Roman saying that said there's nothing more useful than sun and salt. And so the concept of being the salt of the earth referred to people that were respectful and useful in their communities. Now, when we think about people who are salt of the earth people, we think of those down-home, good people, those honest, hardworking, humble people. Those are salt of the earth people. So Jesus, he declared his followers blessed. And then he said, you're blessed, and because of that, you are useful, you are meaningful, you are purposeful. In other words, maybe you've heard that, so you are blessed to be a blessing. You are to be the salt of the earth. You are to be highly valuable to God and extremely useful. He has a powerful purpose for you. That's because salt is quite versatile. Now, I didn't really realize much about that until I really started studying it and how useful salt is. And today we're going to look at 4 ways that salt is useful and how that really affects us as qualities of people of God who are called to be salt of the earth and into our world. So the first one, probably be very familiar with, is that salt flavors. Like I said, I love salt. I love, I used to have get bags of pretzels, and then at the end of that, that pretzel dust at the bottom with all that salt, I'd take it, pour it into my mouth. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Now, I don't really do that so much anymore, unfortunately. That's so good. Yeah. But then if you've ever watched like TV shows where they're cooking competitions, and some of the biggest complaints are the food was lacking flavor or lacking seasoning or wasn't salty enough. And I'm sure we've been there before. We were eating some food, maybe we're at a restaurant or someone's house, and just not salty enough. You feel rude reaching for the salt shaker and dumping it on there. But there's this idea that salt really adds flavor. Both adds flavor and it enhances the flavor. So, like the pretzel bites, the ones without salt are no good. I mean, they're worthless calories, right? But when you add salt to them, they become these delicious pillows of goodness. Oh, man. I'm just going to eat them. So when Jesus is saying that we are the salt of the earth, he's saying that God wants us to enhance and flavor our world, that God is pouring out his beatitude people onto the world to fill it with goodness and love, to bring out the flavor of God's goodness and love. We enhance what God is doing in our world by pouring out his mercy and grace as God is interacting with the world, so people can do, as the psalmist says, taste and see that the Lord is good. So Jesus commissions us to go into the world, to pour ourselves out into the world, to help people understand and experience the delicious good news of Jesus. Now, another purpose for salt, maybe you're familiar with this, is that salt preserves. Right? Now, you might not know this. I did some deep internet research this week. And this is back in Jesus' time, and for probably most of human existence, they didn't have refrigerators. I know, shocking news, right? No refrigerators. Now, a few months ago, our refrigerator went on the fritz. Right? It was not a fun time. Things started not really staying cold, and so we tried to change the filter. That didn't work. I called a repairman who came out and said, "Yep, it would cost more to fix than to repair or buy a new one. So go ahead and buy a new one." And then he's like, "Pay me $75." I'm like, "Okay, thanks for taking my money." Right? But in the meantime, we decided then we have another fridge in our garage, so we started moving our stuff from the one fridge to the other. But that one became overworked and started not functioning properly. So there we are. 2 fridges where we used to have We had no fridge now, right? So what we're going to do, so I remembered salt was a preservative, so I just poured a bunch of salt into our fridges. And I waited for the new fridge to get there. Okay, I didn't really do that. But in the ancient times, people would, they would use the salt to preserve. They would like pack meat in salt, right, to keep it from rotting. And so those listening to Jesus, when they hear, you are the salt of the earth, this is probably one of the ideas that they started thinking, oh, salt, I can understand what it's useful for. But then how do we connect the spiritual metaphor? What is he really getting at? What does that mean? So we have to kind of wrestle with that. Now, as Jesus is saying, we've got to preserve the good old days, the good old ways things used to be, the things that our forefathers valued. There's nothing wrong with those things, but I don't think that's what he was getting at, because you look at the next section of this and of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus starts talking about this is the way things used to be, but this is what I'm saying, this is the way things should be. You've heard it said this, but I say this. You've heard it said, do not murder, but I say, if you're angry with someone, you've murdered them in your heart. He says, you've heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you lust after someone, you've committed adultery in your hearts. She said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say, turn the other cheek. You've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. So Jesus isn't really telling, you've got to preserve this old way of doing things. He's the one who's come and he's declared, I am making all things new. So what do we do with this idea of salt being a preservative? Well, let's turn to a Greek philosopher, everyone's favorite Greek philosopher and historian, Plutarch. I don't know if you know Plutarch. He's very famous, I guess. That's how you spell it. Maybe that's how you pronounce it. I don't know. But he says, meat is a dead body. And as part of a dead body, it will, if left to itself, go bad. Right? Thanks. Classic, of course we know that. But salt preserves it and keeps it fresh. Therefore, it is like a new soul inserted into a dead body. A new soul inserted into a dead body. So, you are the salt of the earth. You're being poured out into the world to bring new life into a dead and dying world. We are called as people of God to be preserving people for the gospel, to insert a new soul, the soul of God, into them, into our dying and decaying world, to help pull people out of their rotting and sinful lives and into God. Jesus, he told them, how are we to preserve these people? What does that look like then for us to be preservative there? And Jesus told them that just moments ago. If you want to be a preserving agent, then you need to be poor in spirit and to be mourning and to be meek and humble and to crave righteousness and extend mercy and to be pure-hearted and to endure persecution for righteousness. That beatitude people of the salt of the earth, people that are out there preserving people for God. Now the next one, this is probably the most popular one to talk about in church, is fertilizer, right? Now I don't know much about fertilizer in general, but as I was researching it, they said that they would put salt on the ground to help kind of loosen the dirt. So to help them cultivate the dirt, and they would mix salt in with the fertilizer to help the plants grow. Maybe that's why Jesus said that if salt loses its saltiness, it's not fit for the soil or for the manure pile. Right? So maybe he's helping them understand that these uses of salt. So we, as God's people, are called to be the salt of the earth, helping and make it easier for the grace of God to grow into people's lives. As the salt of the earth, we're being poured out into our world to be a catalyst for people to experience the amazing grace and the powerful peace that comes from faith in Jesus, to help make the soil of their heart ready for the seeds of faith to take root and grow. The final idea of salt, this is something we're probably all familiar with, and I kind of forgot this as I lived in Texas for a while, but when we moved here, realized salt melts, right? Something we've all faced, the dreaded ice, and it's coming, it's looming, isn't it, right? We're all getting ready. We get those big bags of salt for our little roads and the sidewalks and all over the place. Thank God we have this salt, right? Because when you throw salt out into your ice-covered driveway, something magical happens. At least it seems magical to me. I don't understand the science of it. But the salt begins to break down and melt the ice. And as salt of the earth being poured out into the frozen tundra of our sinful world, we are to help the gospel penetrate into places we thought were unreachable. We're to be poured out into the frozen hearts of those who don't know Jesus. We're to help loosen and break apart the strongholds of sin in people's lives. And somehow, unbeknownst to us, somehow God works in us and through us to help make a difference in our world. That Jesus melts the ice, that we help Jesus melt the ice that's covered the cold hearts of people so that they can experience the love of God. You, my friends, are the salt of the earth. You are highly valued by God. You are his honest, hard-working, humble, beatitude people poured out all over our world to flavor and to preserve and to fertilize and to melt, so that those who are far away from God will be brought near. They can experience his relentless love. You are the salt of the earth. But then Jesus says, if salt loses its saltiness, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. So he said that there might come a time where you might lose your saltiness. And this is an interesting concept, because salt doesn't lose its saltiness. You can have a canister of salt from your cabinet for like 50 years. You go in there, you pull it down, it might be a rock hard, you got to break it apart, but it's still useful for preserving or flavoring meat or melting ice, right? You can have a nice ice storm outside of your house, and you've ran out of salt, and so you have to bust out your Himalayan salt shaker and just spray it on it, and it would work. It would melt the ice of your driveway, because salt, no matter what kind, doesn't lose its saltiness. So I have to wonder, what does Jesus mean by that? What does he mean by losing saltiness? See, in that region of the world, they would most likely get their salt. Does anyone know where they would get their salt? From the Dead Sea, right? I heard of different options, but I'm going to go with the Dead Sea, right? The Dead Sea. And I've never been there, so I don't really. I looked at some of these pictures on the internet. These are like salt clumps, these big just salts there out on them. So they would harvest that salt, and that would be the salt that they would use for all the various needs that they have. But they didn't really have filtration system or way to like separate the salt from, like, there was dust that would form around that and sand that would get mixed in. And so you might get some salt, what you think is salt, some nice white powder, and then you making breakfast, you sprinkle on your eggs, and you realize it was sand. Ugh, that would ruin your meal, right? Or you think you're packing some meat in some salt, and it ends up being just sandy salt, and it causes your meat to rot. Or you might try to use it to prepare the ground for your fields, and it wouldn't work because it was mixed in with things. It was some salt, but it was also mixed in with a lot of other things, so it loses its saltiness. It really isn't doing what it's supposed to do. And this is a message, really, that's repeated throughout the Bible. Throughout the Bible, there's this story of mixing things in with your faith. Jesus or God told the people as they were settling into Israel not to intermarry with the people around. He wasn't thinking these people were terrible people, but he knew that they would come and they would corrupt their faith. They would taint their faith. And we see it over and over. As we look through the Old Testament, we see that these people would intermarry and they would start losing their faith, and God would have to come in and do things. We see it with Paul in many of the letters that he wrote. We talk about how they were letting things into their faith that weren't part of the gospel of grace. One of the big things was circumcision. People saying they had to be circumcised in order to be saved, and Paul kept trying to correct them. No, you don't have to be. It's by grace alone that you are saved. And in Revelation, Jesus sends messages to the churches talking about how they are allowing things to come into their churches and causing them to be corrupted and pull away from Jesus. William Barclay, this is not about the salt thing, but he says that, salt is food, but he says, when a thing loses its essential quality and fails to perform its essential duty, it's fit for nothing but to be thrown away. So if we're to be salt into our dying world, and instead of doing what we're supposed to be, flavoring and preserving and fertilizing and melting, we allow the world to come in and infiltrate our lives and things to us to lose our effectiveness and our purpose. We lose our saltiness. So, have you lost your saltiness? Good question. Good thing to wrestle with. Wrestle with, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for you? How does that look in my life? If I allow things to come into my life and overtake my faith? Have I incorporated things and given them a place of honor that they shouldn't? Should I, instead of being poor in spirit, am I looking to be rich and famous? Instead of mourning my sinfulness, am I reveling in it? Instead of seeking humility and meekness, am I egotistical and arrogant? Instead of hungering for what is right, am I lusting for what is wrong? Instead of being merciful, am I being vengeful? Instead of seeking purity of heart, am I allowing things to come in and contaminate me? Instead of working for peace, am I causing division? Instead of facing the consequences for doing right, am I hiding behind what is safe and easy? Jesus' brother James, he wrote this in his book. He said, "Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this: to look after the orphans and the widows in their distress and keep oneself unstained from the world." So if you want to be salty in our world, we need to care for those who can't care for themselves, the widows and the orphans, those who need to experience God's love. And don't let the things of this world come in and stain us and contaminate our faith. Because we are the salt of the earth. We are being poured out onto our world to help redeem those who are lost. And Jesus asked that question: if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? That's a good question. I mean, first, it seems almost impossible that it could, right? So what do we do with that? How do we become salty again? What can we do? What are the strategies? And I'm not going to give you many strategies except for this. This is what Jesus also said when he was talking about rich people getting into the kingdom of heaven. And the disciples were like, how is this possible? And he says that with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. With God, all things are possible. So if you feel like if you've lost your saltiness, don't lose heart. Cry out to God. Seek God. Be like David. David who was a man after God's own heart, but then had a major catastrophe in his life, right? He slept with Bathsheba, he had her husband killed, all these terrible things that he did. How could he be made salty again? Couldn't. But this is what he says. He says, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion. Blot out my transgressions. Create in me a pure heart, O God. Renew a steadfast spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation. So if you feel like you've lost your saltiness, cry out to God. Ask him to create in you a pure heart, to renew that steadfast spirit, to restore the joy of your salvation. Because God has a purpose and a plan for you. You are the salt of the earth. So stay salty. Amen.